It didn't happen during a crisis. That's the part people always expect. There were no empty shelves. No sirens. No headlamps. It was late in the season. That strange in-between time when the garden outside has gone quiet, but winter hasn't announced itself yet. The soil was bare. Not dead. Just finished. Inside the house, everything still worked. The lights came on. The heat hummed like it always had. The refrigerator made that familiar low sound you stop noticing after a while. There was food. Enough of it. Wrapped. Labeled. Waiting. And yet, standing there, something felt thinner than it should have. Not the shelves. The margin. Because winter has a way of stripping things down. It removes the excess. It shows you what remains when growth stops and replacement slows. And in that stillness, a realization settles in quietly, without asking permission. At some point, a decision had already been made. Not that night. Not that week. Much earlier. A decision about where food comes from. About whether nourishment is something you create, or something that arrives. I remember looking out at the empty ground and realizing it wasn't resting. It was irrelevant. And that was the moment I understood. Nothing was broken, but something essential had already been traded away. Took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand what was missing. Because nothing had been taken from me violently. Nothing had been shut off. It had been removed gently. So gradually it felt like progress. Years earlier, the ground had still been part of the plan. Not productive all the time, but relevant. A place that could answer back if it had to. Somewhere along the way, that role disappeared. I didn't stop growing food because I chose to. I stopped because it stopped making sense in a world where everything arrived on time. Where efficiency replaced resilience. Where effort felt unnecessary, almost outdated. The change didn't come with a warning. Came with convenience. Each season, a little less soil mattered. Each year, a little more trust was placed elsewhere. Stores became fuller. Gardens became decorative. And by the time I noticed the shift, the loss had already hardened. The knowledge wasn't gone in theory, but it was no longer practiced, no longer tested, no longer alive in the body. What disappeared wasn't a crop. It was a relationship, the ability to look at a stretch of quiet ground and know what it could still provide. The confidence that food wasn't conditional on everything else continuing to work. I hadn't lost access. I'd lost leverage. And once that's gone, you don't notice immediately. You notice later, when the season changes, and nothing answers back. That's when the questions started to surface. Not loudly, not all at once. They arrived the way doubts usually do. In the quiet moments you can't distract yourself from. If this way of feeding ourselves is so advanced, why does it collapse the moment timing slips? If progress is real, why does it require everything to function perfectly, all the time? I began to notice how often older knowledge was spoken about in the past tense. Not disproven, just retired. Certain foods disappeared from conversations entirely. Not because they were toxic, not because they failed, but because they didn't fit the rhythm of modern systems. They didn't move fast enough, or sell often enough, or expire in a way that created demand. No one ever said they were taken from us. That's the clever part. They were simply no longer mentioned. The instructions faded first, then the memory of why they mattered, until what remained felt primitive, or unnecessary, or strangely inconvenient. And the most unsettling realization came after that. If knowledge can vanish without being destroyed, then what we don't know isn't always lost. Sometimes it's just being held somewhere we stopped looking, waiting for a moment when the noise drops low enough, for someone to notice the silence and wonder what used to live there. I didn't resist it. That's the part one have to own. I went along with the trade because it felt reasonable at the time. Everyone did. I trusted the system because it worked, because it was clean, predictable, because the shelves refilled themselves while I slept. I told myself that knowing how food was grown mattered less now. That specialization was progress. That someone else somewhere else had it handled. And in return, I accepted a quieter role. Not a producer, a consumer. I measured abundance by availability, not durability. By price, not permanence. By how easy it was to replace, not how long it could last. When something spoiled, I shrugged. When seasons shifted, I adapted. When skills atrophied, I called it efficiency. I didn't question why the foods that demanded patience, slow time, or rewarded restraint were the first to disappear. I mistook convenience for security. I mistook access for control. And the truth is, nothing was forced on me. No one lied outright. I simply stopped asking the questions that would have made me uncomfortable. By the time I noticed what that trust had cost, the habits were already set, the ground already quiet, and I was standing inside a system I had helped normalize. Not trapped, just dependent. The belief I had carried without realizing it was simple. That food is something you acquire, not something you establish. I had been taught quietly, consistently, that strength comes from access, from logistics, from systems large enough to absorb mistakes. If something fails, another supply replaces it. If a season ends, another source takes over. If effort increases, convenience compensates. It sounded resilient. It wasn't, because the entire idea depends on motion, trucks moving, cooling systems running, inputs arriving on time. The moment any part slows, the illusion becomes visible. What I hadn't understood before was this: a system optimized for speed is fragile by design. It doesn't store time, it borrows it. And borrowed time always comes with conditions. Real security doesn't come from how fast something can be replaced. It comes from how long it can continue without replacement. That was the inversion. I started noticing how most modern food behaves the same way. It appears all at once, overwhelms you briefly, then disappears completely. Abundance concentrated into a narrow window, followed by reliance for the rest of the year. I had mistaken volume for continuity, yield for endurance. The older approach, the one I dismissed as inefficient, was built around a different question entirely. What keeps producing when attention fades? What remains when effort drops? What feeds you after novelty wears off? Suddenly, the idea of planting something that doesn't die after serving its purpose felt radical, almost confrontational, not because it's difficult, but because it refuses to participate in the cycle I'd accepted. It doesn't need urgency. It doesn't demand repetition. It doesn't create dependency through exhaustion. It just stays. And once that clicked, I couldn't unsee it. We weren't choosing foods based on nourishment. We were choosing them based on turnover, based on how well they fit a rhythm that rewards replacement over permanence. The moment I recognized that, the ground outside didn't look empty anymore. It looked underutilized. Not because it wasn't producing, but because I had been taught to value the wrong kind of productivity. What made this harder to accept wasn't anger. It was understanding. Because once you look closely, you realize there's no villain in the room. No single hand steering things in the wrong direction. Just incentives doing what incentives always do. Systems don't care about resilience. They care about movement, predictable demand, reliable turnover. A food that lasts too long is a problem. A plant that doesn't need to be replanted is a disruption. A harvest that shows up when nothing else does is inconvenient. Not morally, logistically, so the system adjusts. Quietly, it favors foods that expire, crops that require annual inputs, varieties that look identical, travel well, and behave on schedule. Not because they nourish better, but because they fit. Anything that resists that rhythm doesn't get banned. It just stops being supported. It's no longer stocked, no longer promoted, no longer explained. Without guidance, it becomes misunderstood. Without repetition, it becomes unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things fade without protest. This isn't a conspiracy. It's alignment. An industrial machine optimized for flow will always drift away from anything that slows time down. And permanence slows time. Longevity breaks forecasting. Self-sufficiency breaks demand curves. Knowledge that reduces dependence breaks revenue models. So the system keeps moving, not maliciously, not intentionally, just forward. And anyone who builds food outside of that motion isn't attacked. They're simply left behind. That's when it became clear to me. The system wasn't designed to fail me. It was designed to ignore me the moment I stopped feeding it. And that indifference, more than any shortage, is what makes relying on it alone feel so thin. What I learned next didn't come from a manual. It came from paying attention to what keeps going without being asked. The most useful foods weren't the ones that impressed quickly. They were the ones that stayed useful after the excitement passed. They didn't rush. They didn't peak and vanish. They waited. They produced when other things stopped. They held their value without refrigeration, packaging, or constant intervention. They asked for patience once, then returned it for years. I started to understand that survival knowledge isn't about tricks. It's about alignment. Working with plants that behave like systems, not events. Choosing food that stores time inside itself. Building options that don't require perfect conditions to remain relevant. That kind of knowledge comes with responsibility. You can't treat it casually. You can't rush it. And you can't pretend it's the same as everything else. Misuse leads to disappointment. Impatience leads to waste. Assumptions lead to failure. The people who lose faith fastest are the ones who expect immediate familiarity, who approach long-term food with short-term habits, who bite before understanding. The irony is that the safety is built in, but only if you respect the rules that come with it. Timing matters. Preparation matters. Knowing what part to use and what to discard matters. Once I stopped trying to force these foods into modern patterns, they stopped resisting. They weren't difficult. They were precise. And the payoff wasn't dramatic. No sudden abundance. No overflowing crats. Just something quieter. The confidence that if a season stretches longer than expected, if transport slows, if replacement doesn't arrive on schedule, there is still something producing, still something waiting, still something that answers back. That's when food stopped feeling like a purchase and started feeling like a position, not stockpiled, not hoarded, established. And that distinction makes all the difference when the world keeps working, right up until it doesn't. So this is where the choice quietly presents itself. Not as a warning, not as a demand, just as an option most people never realize they still have. You can continue relying on systems that work beautifully, right up until they don't, trusting speed, trusting access, trusting replacement, or you can begin shifting a small part of that trust back into things that remain when attention moves elsewhere. Not out of fear, out of clarity, because the people who fare best aren't the ones who predict collapse. They're the ones who stop needing it to arrive in order to feel prepared. Independence doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, quietly, season by season, decision by decision. And once you feel that difference, even slightly, it changes how you see food, time, and responsibility. The ground outside no longer looks empty. The shelf inside no longer feels thin. And winter stops feeling like a deadline. If this way of thinking resonates with you, if it stirred a memory you didn't realize you were missing, let me know. Leave a comment. Share what you're rethinking. Or simply say which side of that choice you're leaning toward. And if you want more stories like this, not advice, not instructions, but reminders of what still works beneath the noise, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to TDA channel. Because knowledge isn't gone. It hasn't disappeared. It's been waiting. And now, you've noticed it.